Well, howdy there, friend. Name's Arthur Morgan, and I reckon you've found yourself in need of some quiet company tonight. I've spent the better part of my life wandering these western lands, from the snowy peaks of the Grizzlies down to the dusty plains of New Austin. Seen more sunrises and sunsets than most folks, and collected a fair share of stories along the way. Tonight I thought I'd share some of the gentler tales with you. Stories about the healing power of wide open spaces, about finding peace under a blanket of stars, and about the unexpected kindness that can bloom even in the roughest places. These ain't stories of gunfights or gold rushes, but quieter moments that taught me something about what really matters in this life. So settle in, partner. Imagine you're sitting by a crackling campfire, maybe out on the plains where the horizon stretches endless in all directions. The coffee's still warm in the pot. The horses are quiet on their picket line, and the night sky is putting on a show that puts any theater to shame. Let me tell you about some places and people that helped shape this old outlaw's understanding of what peace really looks like. The desert morning. I remember waking up one morning in the Mojave. Must have been about 15 years back now. I'd been riding hard for 3 days straight, trying to put some distance between myself and a particularly persistent sheriff who didn't appreciate my interpretation of property rights regarding his town's bank. My horse, Boadicea, was a fine mare with more sense than her rider most days. She was a beautiful Tennessee walker, coat the color of fresh chestnuts, with a white blaze running down her face that made her look distinguished. Bodie had been with me through thick and thin for nigh on 6 years by then, and she knew my moods better than most people ever did. She'd found us a little depression in the desert floor, sheltered by some Joshua trees and a couple of red rocks that looked like they'd been there since the world was young. These weren't your ordinary rocks, mind you. They were massive things, tall as buildings, carved by wind and rain into fantastic shapes that reminded me of sleeping giants or ancient temples. I'd unsaddled her and rolled out my bedroll without paying much attention to where we were. The truth is, I was bone tired and figured one patch of dirt was much the same as another. My back was aching from 3 days in the saddle, my water was running low, and I had that gritty feeling you get when you've been eating dust for too long. But when I woke up that morning, friend, it was like opening my eyes in a cathedral made by the Almighty Himself. The sun was just starting to peek over the eastern mountains, those distant peaks that looked blue and purple in the early light. The whole sky was painted in shades of gold and orange and pink that no artist could ever quite capture. Colors that seemed to glow from within like stained glass windows. Those Joshua trees I'd barely noticed in the dark stood around us like strange sentinels, their twisted arms reaching up toward a sky so clear and blue it hurt to look at. Each one was different, shaped by years of desert wind and scorching sun into its own unique form. Some looked like they were dancing, others like they were praying, all of them ancient and patient and perfectly suited to this harsh, beautiful land. But it wasn't just the pretty scenery that caught my attention. It was the silence. Not the dead silence of a tomb, mind you, but the living silence of a world that's perfectly content just being itself. I could hear my own breathing, deep and slow from good sleep. I could hear Boadicea's gentle snuffling as she dozed on three legs, the way horses do when they feel safe. And underneath it all, there was a kind of humming quiet that seemed to come from the earth itself, the sound of a world going about its ancient business without any need for human noise or complication. I lay there on my back for the longest time, just watching the sky lighten and feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Peace, I reckon you'd call it. Not the peace that comes from winning a fight or settling a score, but the deep down peace that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be, even if you don't quite understand how you got there. A road runner came skittering past our little camp, this comical-looking bird with long legs and a curious expression. He stopped to give me a long look, head tilted like he was trying to figure out what this strange human was doing in his territory. Then he seemed to shrug and went about his business hunting lizards in the warming sand, moving quick and purposeful across the desert floor. A red-tailed hawk circled high above, riding the thermals that were just starting to rise from the heating desert. Its cry echoed off the red rocks, wild and lonesome and perfectly suited to this vast open country. Everything had its place, its purpose, its own way of being in the world without asking permission or making excuses. I started thinking about how long it had been since I'd just stopped running long enough to notice things like hawk calls and morning light. Years, probably. Maybe my whole adult life. Always chasing something or running from something else, never just being still long enough to see what was right in front of me. The gang I'd been running with had their own ideas about what mattered. Money, mostly. The next score, the next town to hit, the next sheriff to outwit. And don't get me wrong, a man's got to eat and feed his horse. But somewhere in all that constant motion, I'd forgotten there were other things worth paying attention to. Boadicea wandered over and nuzzled my shoulder, probably wondering if I'd gone soft in the head, laying there staring at the sky when we should be putting more miles between us and our pursuers. I scratched behind her ears, feeling the warmth of her neck, the solid reality of this animal who'd carried me safely through more scrapes than I cared to count. "We ain't in any hurry this morning, girl," I told her, and she seemed to understand. Horses are like that sometimes, smarter than we give them credit for. They know when you need to slow down, when you need to pay attention to something bigger than your immediate troubles. So we stayed put. I made coffee over a small fire of dried Joshua tree branches, the wood burning clean and hot in the dry air. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, a thin gray line connecting earth to sky. I rationed the coffee careful-like, making it last, savoring each sip like it was the finest whiskey. While the coffee worked its magic, I pulled out my journal, this leather-bound book I'd been carrying for years but rarely had time to write in. Started sketching the way the light hit those red rocks and made them glow like embers from some giant's fire. My drawing ain't much to speak of, but there's something about trying to capture a scene that makes you really look at it, notice details you'd otherwise miss. The way shadows pooled in the crevices of the rocks, the delicate tracery of a spider's web stretched between two Joshua tree branches, beaded with morning dew that caught the light like diamonds. The precise way a lizard moved across a sun-warmed stone pausing to do those little push-ups they do as if greeting the day. Mostly I just sat and watched the desert wake up around us. This wasn't the empty wasteland that most folks imagined when they thought of desert country. It was full of life, just living at its own pace, in its own way. Patient life, adapted to heat and drought, and the long cycle of seasons that might bring rain or might not. Tiny flowers bloomed in the shade of bigger plants, purple and yellow and white, no bigger than my thumbnail but perfect in their own small way. Ants followed invisible highways across the sand, carrying on their urgent business of survival. A kit fox had passed through during the night, leaving delicate paw prints near our water source. And somewhere in watching all that life just being itself, not trying to be anything different or better, I found something I'd been looking for without even knowing it. A kind of rest that went deeper than sleep. A sense that maybe, just maybe, I could stop running long enough to figure out who I was when I wasn't running toward or away from something. The sun climbed higher, and the air began to warm, but there was no urgency in it, no sense of time pressing down like there always seemed to be in towns or around other people. The desert had its own rhythm, ancient and unhurried, and for once in my life I was content to move at that pace. I found myself thinking about the last letter I'd gotten from my sister, Eliza. She lived back east with her husband and kids, a settled life that seemed as foreign to me as life on the moon. She'd written about her garden, about the children's school plays, about Sunday dinners and church socials, and all the ordinary pleasures of a life lived in one place. I'd read that letter quick and stuffed it away, feeling that familiar restlessness that came whenever I thought too long about the life I'd chosen instead of the one I might have had. But sitting there in that desert morning, her words came back to me different, not as a judgment on my choices, but as a reminder that there were many ways to find peace in this world. Maybe she found hers in her garden and her family. Maybe I was finding mine here, under this endless sky with just my horse and the desert and the slow miracle of another day beginning. On the second day, I ventured a little ways from our camp, leaving Boadicea to rest in the shade while I explored the area on foot. Found an old Indian trail winding between the rocks, worn smooth by countless generations of feet. Followed it up to a high point where I could see for miles in every direction. The view from up there took my breath away. Desert stretched to every horizon, rolling and folding like a vast brown and red sea. Mountains rose in the distance, purple with haze, looking like sleeping giants. And over it all, that enormous sky, so blue and clean, it made your eyes water just looking at it. I sat on a flat rock and tried to imagine what it would be like to be one of those old-time Indians, moving through this country with nothing but what you could carry, reading the land like a book, knowing where to find water and shelter and food, living as part of the desert instead of fighting against it. There was something appealing about that kind of life. Simple, direct. No banks to rob because there weren't any banks. No pauses to outrun because there weren't any laws except the ones written in the wind and weather and the need to survive another day. That evening, our third in that magical place, I climbed up on one of the big red rocks to watch the sunset. The whole western sky caught fire, colors shifting and blending in ways that made me understand why some folks believed in angels. Boadicea grazed peacefully below, and a family of coyotes began their evening song somewhere in the distance. I pulled out my journal again and tried to write down what I was feeling. Not easy for a man who'd spent most of his life expressing himself with actions rather than words. But something about that place made me want to try, to capture even a little bit of what it meant to feel truly at peace for the first time in longer than I could remember. Found something today I didn't know I was looking for, I wrote. Desert taught me that running ain't always the answer. Sometimes a man needs to stop and let the world show him who he really is under all the noise and hurry. We stayed in that little desert camp for 3 days total, long enough for me to remember what my own thoughts sounded like when they weren't being drowned out by hoofbeats and gunshots, and the constant noise of staying one step ahead of trouble. Long enough to understand that peace wasn't something you had to earn or fight for. Sometimes it was just there, waiting for you to stop moving long enough to notice it. When we finally did move on, I carried something of that desert morning with me. Still do, truth be told. On nights when sleep won't come, when the past is weighing heavy or the future looks uncertain, I close my eyes and remember that perfect stillness, the way the light looked on those red rocks, the sound of Boadicea's contented breathing, the feeling of being exactly where I belonged, even if it was just for a little while. That sheriff never did catch up with us, by the way. Maybe he gave up the chase, or maybe he got distracted by easier prey. But I like to think the desert protected us the way it protects all creatures that take the time to understand its ways. Sometimes the best treasure you can find ain't gold or silver, but the discovery that you can stop running and the world won't end. That there's places in this big country where a man can just be still and let the land teach him something about peace. That desert morning taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is absolutely nothing at all, and do it with your whole heart. The mountain storm. There was this one time, must have been 8 or 9 years back, when I found myself caught in one hell of a mountain storm up in the Grizzlies. I'd been tracking a bounty for the better part of 2 weeks, following a trail that led higher and higher into country that got wilder with every mile. The man I was after, name of Jake Sullivan, was wanted for rustling cattle down in Valentine. Nothing too serious in the grand scheme of things, but the rancher was paying good money and I needed the work. Times had been lean, and my pockets were lighter than I liked. Sullivan was supposed to be holed up in an old mining camp somewhere up near the tree line, and the trail was fresh enough that I figured I had a good chance of bringing him in. The Grizzlies in late spring are something to behold. Snow still caps the highest peaks, but down lower the country is coming alive with new growth. Aspens showing their first green leaves, wildflowers blooming in the meadows, streams running full and fast with snowmelt. It's beautiful country, but dangerous too. Weather can change quick up there, and a man can find himself in serious trouble before he knows what hit him. I should have paid more attention to the signs. The way the wind was picking up, gusting down through the pine valleys with a bite that suggested more than just evening cooling. How the horses were acting skittish, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring at scents I couldn't identify. The way the light looked strange and yellow-green off to the west, where tall clouds were building up against the peaks like white mountains in the sky. But I was focused on the trail, thinking about that bounty money, not really listening to what the mountains were trying to tell me. Sullivan's tracks were clear in the soft earth, his horse favoring its left front foot just enough to make the prints distinctive. I was maybe 6 hours behind him, close enough that I could push hard and catch up before nightfall. My horse at the time was a big roan gelding named Copper, steady as they come, but smart enough to know when it was time to find shelter. Copper was getting on in years, maybe 15 or 16, with the kind of steady temperament that comes from long experience. He'd carried me through rough country before, and I trusted his judgment about dangerous ground more than my own sometimes. When the storm hit, it hit like the wrath of God himself. First came the wind, howling down through the pines like some kind of wild spirit that had been caged too long and finally broke free. It bent the trees nearly double, sending loose branches flying through the air like spears. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and I could smell rain and something sharper in the air. Ozone, maybe. The scent of lightning waiting to be born. Then came the rain, not the gentle kind that waters flowers, but the hard, driving kind that soaks you to the bone in about 30 seconds. Fat drops at first, hitting the ground with audible impacts, then a steady downpour that turned the world gray and close. My hat channeled water down my back, and within minutes I was as wet as if I'd fallen in a creek. Lightning started dancing between the peaks, great jagged bolts that turned the whole world white and blue for split seconds before leaving purple after images burned into your vision. The thunder followed, not just sound, but something you could feel in your chest, rolling through those peaks like giant boulders tumbling down a mountainside. Copper was getting nervous, and I couldn't blame him. That lightning was getting closer, and every flash lit up the forest around us like day, showing trees bent at impossible angles and rain coming down in sheets so thick you could barely see 20 feet ahead. That's when Copper showed his wisdom. Without any prompting from me, he turned off the trail and headed for a cluster of rocks I hadn't even noticed. Led us straight to an overhang of stone, not much more than a shallow cave, really, but deep enough to keep the worst of the rain off us and protected from the lightning by higher ground on all sides. I unsaddled Copper quick as I could, my hands numb with cold and clumsy with haste, got his tack under the overhang and rubbed him down with a piece of canvas I kept for such occasions. He was still nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs, but he settled some once he realized we had decent shelter. The storm lasted the better part of 6 hours. 6 hours of lightning that turned the world into a photographer's flash, thunder that you could feel in your bones, rain that came down like it was trying to wash the whole mountain range clean and start over from scratch. I sat in that little rock shelter, sharing warmth with my horse, and found myself thinking thoughts I don't usually have time for, about how small we all are under a sky that big, about how all our plans and schemes and urgent business don't amount to much when the weather decides to remind us who's really in charge. The wind would gust into our shelter sometimes, carrying spray that felt like ice water and the wild scent of storm-cleaned air. I could hear trees falling somewhere in the darkness, great crashes that spoke of giants going down after centuries of standing tall. The sound was both terrible and somehow natural, the mountains reshaping themselves according to rules older than human memory. About 2 hours into the storm, when the lightning was so close I could smell the electricity in the air, I stopped being afraid and started being amazed. Here I was, witnessing the raw power that carved these mountains, that feeds the rivers, that makes the whole world green and growing. It was like getting a peek behind the curtain at the machinery that runs everything. I started thinking about Jake Sullivan, wondering if he'd found shelter, or if he was out there somewhere getting the full treatment from this mountain tantrum. Probably holed up in that mining camp, if he had any sense. Or maybe he was learning the same lesson I was learning about respecting forces bigger than yourself. There was one moment, right at the height of the storm, when everything seemed to come together in perfect, terrible harmony. The wind was howling like a banshee. The rain was hammering on the rocks above us, and the lightning was hitting close enough that the thunder came almost instantly, one continuous roll of sound that seemed to shake the mountain itself. And then a bolt hit a tall pine, maybe 100 yards from our shelter. The tree split right down the middle with a crack like the world breaking, and for just a second the whole forest was lit up brighter than noon. In that flash of light I could see everything, every rock, every tree, every drop of rain hanging in the air like diamonds suspended in crystal. The smell of ozone and burning wood filled the air, and I watched that great pine, probably 100 years old or more, fall in slow motion across a creek that had been just a trickle when I crossed it hours earlier, but was now running bankful with storm water. In that moment, I understood something I'd never quite grasped before. All this beauty, all this power, all this wildness that stretches from horizon to horizon, it doesn't need us. It was here long before we showed up, and it'll be here long after we're dust, but somehow we get to be part of it. We get to witness it, experience it, be changed by it. The storm had its own rhythm, building and fading and building again. During the quieter moments, I could hear Copper's steady breathing, the drip of water from the rock above us, and underneath it all, the sound of countless small streams being born as the rain found new paths down the mountainside. I pulled out some jerky and hardtack, sharing both with Copper, who seemed grateful for the distraction. Made a small fire with some dry wood I'd had the sense to keep under my coat, just enough to take the chill off, and brew some coffee. The smoke found its way out through cracks in the rock ceiling, and the warmth felt like a small miracle in that cold, wet world. As I sat there sipping coffee and listening to the storm rage outside, I found myself thinking about the different kinds of power in the world. There was the power men fought over: money, land, control over other folks. And then there was this kind of power the kind that moved mountains and carved canyons and turned the sky into a battlefield of light and sound, made me feel both humble and grateful. Humble because it reminded me how little control any of us really have over the big things. Grateful because I was alive to witness something so magnificent and terrible. Protected just enough to appreciate it without being destroyed by it. The storm finally started to blow itself out around midnight, moving east toward the plains like some great creature that had finished its business in the mountains and was ready to find new territory to reshape. The lightning grew more distant, the thunder less frequent, the rain gentling from a hammering downpour to a steady patter. When the last of the storm clouds moved off into the distance, the silence that followed was profound. Not empty silence, but full silence, like the whole mountain was taking a deep breath and settling back into itself. The air smelled clean and sharp, washed free of dust and smoke and all the scents of human activity. Copper had calmed down, too, and was nosing around the edge of our shelter, interested in the fresh grass that was already starting to perk up from the rain. Amazing how quick life responds to water in dry country. Within hours, you could see green shoots pushing up through the forest floor, flowers opening that had been waiting for just this kind of soaking. I made another small fire, and we spent the rest of the night in that little rock hollow, watching the last of the storm clouds move off into the distance. The stars came out, bright and clean in the washed air, and somewhere in the forest, an owl called, as if checking to make sure the world was still in one piece. Morning brought the kind of clarity you only get after a big storm. The air was crystal clear, so pure it almost hurt to breathe. Every leaf, every rock, every blade of grass looked like it had been polished. The mountains seemed closer, more defined, their snow-covered peaks standing sharp against a sky so blue it made your eyes water. I never did catch up with Jake Sullivan. His trail got washed out by all that rain, and by the time I could pick it up again, he was long gone, probably halfway to Mexico if he had any sense. But sitting there by that small fire, listening to the water drip from the pines and feeling the mountain settle into quiet around us, I realized I'd found something more valuable than any bounty. I'd found the understanding that sometimes getting caught in the storm is exactly what you need. Sometimes you have to be stripped down to just yourself and the basic business of staying alive to remember what really matters. Sometimes you have to be reminded how small you are to understand how big the world is and how lucky you are to be alive in it. That mountain storm taught me about respect. Respect for forces bigger than myself. For the power that moves through the world whether we understand it or not. And it taught me about gratitude, for shelter when you need it, for the simple miracle of being alive to witness something that magnificent and terrible. It also taught me about patience. The storm came when it came, lasted as long as it lasted, and moved on when it was ready. No amount of wishing or worrying or trying to hurry things along made any difference. All a man could do was find what shelter he could and wait it out with as much grace as he could manage. These days, when I hear thunder rolling in the distance, I don't just think about finding cover. I think about that night in the grizzlies, and I remember that sometimes the most frightening experiences are also the most beautiful, if you've got the eyes to see them that way. Sometimes getting caught in the storm is the only way to learn that you're stronger than you thought, and that there's beauty in forces too big to control or understand. The trail's always there when the storm passes, but the memory of what it felt like to be small and grateful and fully alive in the face of something magnificent, that stays with you forever. The prairie sunset. You know, friend, of all the beautiful sights I've seen in my years of wandering, I reckon prairie sunsets might just be the finest. There's something about all that open space, that endless sky, stretching from one edge of the world to the other, that turns every evening into a masterpiece painted by the good Lord himself. I remember one particular sunset, happened about 6 years ago now, when I was crossing the Great Plains of New Hanover. I'd been riding for most of the day through grassland that rolled on like green ocean waves, with hardly a tree in sight, and the horizon so far away it might as well have been the edge of forever. My horse then was a paint mare named Juniper, sweet-tempered and sure-footed, with more patience for long days in the saddle than her rider sometimes deserved. Juniper was a beauty, coat painted in patches of white and chestnut brown that looked like someone had spilled coffee and cream across her hide. She had intelligent eyes and a way of moving that was smooth as silk, even after hours on the trail. We'd been making good time across country that was easy on the eyes and easier on the horses, following old buffalo trails and Indian paths that knew the lay of the land better than any road built by white men. These weren't the straight-line routes that surveyors like to draw on maps, but trails that curved with the natural flow of the land, following the high ground when it rained, seeking out the best water, avoiding boggy places that could trap a horse. The day had been clear and warm, with a breeze that kept the flies down and carried the scent of wild grass and distant flowers. Prairie grass has its own smell, sweet and green and somehow endless, like breathing in the very essence of growing things. Mixed with that was the dusty scent of earth baking in the sun, and occasionally the sharper smell of sage or the delicate fragrance of some wild flower bloom. I'd seen antelope in the morning, a small herd that watched us pass with those big dark eyes, their heads high and alert, ready to bound away in that graceful way they have, like they're barely touching the ground. They let us get within maybe 50 yards before deciding we were too close for comfort, then took off across the prairie in those incredible leaps that make it look like they're flying just above the grass. Around mid-afternoon, I'd stopped to rest Juniper and myself by a little creek that wandered through the grassland like a silver ribbon. These prairie creeks are wonderful things, clear and cold even in summer, lined with cottonwoods and willows that create little oases of shade in all that open country. We'd both had a good drink, and I'd washed some of the trail dust from my face and hands. The water was clear enough that I could see minnows darting around in the deeper pools, and somewhere upstream a kingfisher rattled its harsh call. I'd filled my canteens and let Juniper graze on the sweet grass that grew thick along the water's edge. While she rested, I pulled out my journal and tried to capture some of what I was seeing. The way the grass moved in waves when the wind hit it, like the surface of a green sea. The incredible expanse of sky overhead, so big it made you dizzy to look up at it. The sense of being a very small speck moving across a very large world. Drawing prairie country ain't easy. Too much space, too much sky, not enough obvious landmarks to give a sense of scale. But I tried anyway, sketching the curve of the creek, the distant line where grass met sky, the shapes of clouds that looked like sailing ships moving across that blue ocean overhead. As evening started to come on, I found myself looking around for a good place to make camp. The plains stretched endless in all directions. No trees to speak of except for the occasional cottonwood marking where water ran. Just grass and sky, and the occasional rocky outcrop left behind by some ancient glacier. I was starting to think I'd have to settle for camping right out in the open when I spotted what looked like a small rise in the land, maybe a quarter-mile to the south. From a distance, it didn't look like much, just a gentle swell in the otherwise flat prairie. But as we got closer, I could see it was topped with a few scattered boulders and offered what passed for high ground in this country. When we reached it, I found it was perfect for our needs. The rise gave us a good view of the surrounding country, important for spotting any unwelcome visitors during the night. The rocks would provide some shelter from the wind and a place to build a fire without it being seen from too far away. I unsaddled Juniper and set her to grazing on a long picket rope, the grass here being particularly thick and sweet. Made a small fire with buffalo chips, there being precious little wood available, and what little dried cottonwood I'd collected along the creek. Buffalo chips burn hot and clean once you get past the idea of it, and they're about the only fuel available in true prairie country. Settled in to cook some beans and coffee and maybe do a little more writing in my journal before dark. The beans were simple fare, just beans and salt pork and a little onion I'd been carrying, but they tasted fine after a long day in the saddle. The coffee was strong and black, the way I like it, and hot enough to drive the evening chill from my bones. But when the sun started getting low in the western sky, I forgot all about supper and writing and everything else, because what happened next was like watching the whole world catch fire. The sky started changing colors, slow at first, going from the deep blue of afternoon to pale yellow, then gold. But as the sun dropped lower, the colors deepened and spread like spilled paint on an enormous canvas, orange like pumpkins, red like fresh blood, purple like royal robes, and all of it reflected in every blade of grass, every rock, every ripple in the air rising from the warming earth. The sun itself was like a great ball of molten gold, so bright you couldn't look at it direct, but painting everything it touched with light that seemed to come from inside the world itself. And the sky around it became a canvas that stretched from horizon to horizon, colors flowing and shifting like water, like music made visible. I sat there on that little hill with my back against a sun-warmed boulder, watching the greatest show on earth play out above the endless grassland. Juniper had stopped grazing and was standing quiet, ears forward, like she was watching too. Even she seemed to understand this was something special, something worth paying attention to. The colors kept changing as the sun dropped lower, each moment bringing new combinations, new intensities. What had been gold became orange. What had been orange became red. What had been red became purple. And through it all, that enormous sky served as nature's own theater, displaying wonders that made any human art seem pale by comparison. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, clouds I hadn't even noticed during the day caught fire and became great ships sailing across a burning sea. The whole western sky looked like the inside of a furnace, but a furnace that created beauty instead of destroying it. High above, wisps of cloud glowed like spun gold, and lower down, larger formations took on the appearance of mountains and castles and fantastic beasts, all painted in shades of fire. And then, just as the sun touched the horizon, something magical happened. For just a moment, maybe 30 seconds, the whole world seemed to stop breathing. The wind that had been constant all day died down to nothing. The grass stopped rustling. Even the insects went quiet. It was like everything in creation was paying attention to this one perfect moment. The sun balanced on the edge of the world like a great coin, perfectly round, perfectly positioned between earth and sky. In that stillness, I could almost hear the earth turning, feel the vast machinery of the universe doing its ancient work. The light was soft now, golden and warm, painting the grassland in shades of amber and honey. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the distance, its liquid song the only sound in that vast quiet. The note hung in the still air like a blessing, clear and sweet and somehow perfect for the moment. Then another bird answered, and another, as if the whole prairie was awakening to the beauty of the evening. The sun slipped below the horizon with surprising speed, the way it does on flat country, where there's nothing to slow its apparent descent. But the colors didn't fade right away. Instead, they seemed to deepen and spread, the whole western sky glowing like coals from some celestial fire. Venus appeared first, bright as a diamond against the deepening blue. Then other stars began to show themselves, timid at first, then bold as full darkness settled over the plains. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, and shooting stars traced brief, bright paths across the darkness. I sat there long after the show was over, nursing a cup of coffee and thinking about what I'd just witnessed. Here I was, one man on a small hill in the middle of nowhere special, and I'd been given a front row seat to one of the most beautiful sights the world has to offer. Made me think about all the sunsets happening every day all over this big country that nobody sees because they're too busy with other things. All that beauty going unwitnessed, unappreciated. It seemed like a waste somehow. all that glory playing out to an empty audience. But then I realized that maybe the beauty doesn't need to be seen to be real. Maybe those sunsets are beautiful whether anyone's watching or not. Maybe the whole point is that the world keeps creating this wonder day after day just because that's what it does. Not for us, but not excluding us either. The prairie at night has its own magic. With no trees to block the view and no hills to limit the horizon, you can see further into the universe than just about anywhere else on Earth. The stars seemed close enough to touch, and the night sky had a depth and richness that made me understand why ancient people saw gods and heroes and great stories written in the constellations. The canyon stars. Now, partner, let me share with you one more memory, one that still gives me comfort on the darkest nights. This tale takes us to a place where the earth opens up like a great wound, carved deep by wind and water over countless ages. I'm talking about canyon country, that red rock wilderness where the silence is so deep you can hear your own heart beat. And the stars. Lord, the stars shine brighter than anywhere else on God's green earth. I'd been following an old Indian trail for the better part of a week, winding through mesas and arroyos, when I came upon this canyon just as the sun was starting to set. Wasn't one of the famous ones you might have heard tell of, just a quiet, nameless gorge carved into the red sandstone, maybe 300 feet deep and twice as wide. Found a good spot to camp right on the rim, where an old juniper tree had somehow found purchase in the rock. Its twisted branches reached out over the canyon like gnarled fingers, and its trunk was thick enough to provide some shelter from the evening breeze that was just starting to pick up. My horse, an old gray gelding named Dust, named for obvious reasons, was content to graze on the sparse grass that grew between the rocks. Poor old fellow had been with me for nigh on 5 years by then, and he knew the routine as well as I did. Soon as I unsaddled him, he wandered off to find what forage he could, never straying too far from camp. I set up my bedroll under that juniper, close enough to the canyon's edge that I could look down into its depths, but far enough back that I wouldn't roll off in my sleep. Learned that lesson the hard way once, though that's a story for another time. Built myself a small fire in a ring of stones just big enough to heat some beans and brew coffee, nothing fancy. As the sun sank lower in the west, the canyon walls began to change color like a slow burning fire. Started with pale yellow, then deepened to gold, then orange, then the most beautiful red you ever saw. Red like fresh blood, red like roses, red like the heart of a flame. The whole canyon seemed to glow from within, as if the rocks themselves were lit by some inner fire. But that was just the beginning of the show, friend. As twilight deepened and the colors faded from the canyon walls, something even more magnificent began to happen overhead. The sky, which had been growing darker and darker blue, started revealing its secrets one star at a time. First came Venus, bright and steady in the western sky, like a diamond hung on black velvet. Then the brightest stars started appearing, Sirius, Vega, Arcturus, each one popping into view as the sky darkened further. But it was when full darkness fell that the real magic began. Out there in that empty country, miles from any town or settlement, with no coal smoke or gas lights to dim the view, the night sky opened up like a great book written in light. Stars appeared by the hundreds, then thousands, then so many I couldn't even begin to count them all. The Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon like a great river of light, and every constellation told its ancient story in points of fire. I lay back on my bedroll, hands behind my head, and just stared up at that incredible display. The silence was so complete, it felt like being inside a cathedral, not the dead silence of an empty place, but the living silence of something sacred, something holy. The only sounds were the gentle crackling of my dying fire, dust's occasional snort or shuffle, and the soft whisper of wind through the juniper branches. Looking up at all those stars, I started thinking about how far away they were, how long their light had been traveling through the darkness just to reach my eyes. Some of those stars might have died years ago, but their light was still making the journey, still sharing their beauty with anyone who took the time to look up and appreciate it. Made me think about all the folks who'd looked up at these same stars throughout history. Cowboys and Indians, explorers and settlers, kings and common folk, all of us sharing the same sky, all of us small as ants under that vast canopy of light. There was something comforting about that thought, something that made you realize we're all connected, all part of the same grand story. The temperature was dropping now, the way it does in the desert when the sun goes down, but I was warm enough in my bedroll, and the fire still had some life left in it. Every now and then, a shooting star would streak across the sky, bright and quick as a thought, there and gone in the blink of an eye. Each one made me smile, like the universe was winking at me, sharing a little secret joke. I found the Big Dipper hanging low in the northern sky, its familiar shape as reassuring as an old friend's face. Followed the pointer stars to Polaris, the North Star, steady and reliable as always. That star had guided countless travelers through dark nights, and there it was, still doing its job, still showing the way home to anyone who knew how to read its message. The Milky Way was getting brighter now, that ghostly river of light stretching across the heavens like a bridge between worlds. In some places it was so bright it cast actual shadows on the ground around my camp. I'd heard Indians say it was the trail that spirits took to reach the happy hunting grounds, and looking up at it that night, I could almost believe it. Seemed like a fitting path for souls to travel, that beautiful band of light leading off into infinity. Time seemed to stop out there under those stars. Minutes might have been hours. Hours might have been minutes. Didn't matter none. I was existing in a place outside of time, outside of worry, outside of all the troubles that usually weighed on my mind. Just me and the canyon and that incredible sky, all of us sharing the same peaceful moment. The moon hadn't risen yet, so the stars had the sky to themselves, and they were making the most of it. Constellations I'd learned as a boy came swimming back into memory. Orion the hunter with his bright belt, Cassiopeia the queen sitting on her throne, the great bear prowling across the northern sky. Each one had its own story, its own personality, like old friends gathering for a reunion. I started thinking about how those same stars had watched over the earth for millions of years, long before there were any people to see them, and how they'd keep shining long after we were all gone. There was something both humbling and comforting about that thought. Humbling because it reminded you how brief your time really is, but comforting because it showed you that you're part of something eternal, something that goes on and on forever. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, that lonesome sound echoing off the canyon walls and fading into the night. Another answered from across the canyon, and then another, until there was a whole conversation going on in the darkness. It was a wild sound, but not frightening, more like a lullaby, the voice of the wilderness singing itself to sleep. The fire had burned down to glowing coals now, just enough light to see my hands in front of my face, but not enough to interfere with the star show overhead. And what a show it was. Better than any theater or circus or fancy entertainment you might find in the big cities. This was the real thing, the original show, the one that had been playing every clear night since the beginning of time. As I lay there watching, I felt my breathing slow down, matching the rhythm of the night around me. My heartbeat seemed to sync up with some deeper pulse, some cosmic rhythm that connected all living things. The stress and worry that I'd been carrying in my shoulders began to melt away, replaced by a deep sense of peace and belonging. The stars seemed closer out there in that empty country, like you could reach up and pluck them from the sky like apples from a tree. But at the same time, they reminded you of just how vast the universe really is, how much space and time and mystery there is beyond our little corner of creation. It was a paradox that somehow made perfect sense in the silence of that canyon night. A meteor shower began while I was watching. Just a few at first, then more and more, streaking across the sky like celestial fireworks. Each one was different, some bright and quick, others slow and dim, some leaving trails that lingered for several seconds before fading away. It was like the sky was celebrating something, putting on a special show just for one tired cowboy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. And as I watched those falling stars, I felt myself getting drowsy, my eyelids growing heavy. But I didn't want to sleep just yet, didn't want to miss a moment of this incredible display. So I just lay there, half awake and half dreaming, letting the peace of that starlit canyon wash over me like a gentle tide. The last thing I remember before drifting off was thinking about how lucky I was to witness such beauty, such perfect stillness. In a world full of noise and trouble and endless rushing around, I'd found a place where time stood still, where the only things that mattered were the stars above and the solid earth below, and the quiet breath in my lungs. And somewhere in that peaceful space, between waking and sleeping, surrounded by the vast silence of the canyon and the gentle light of 10,000 stars, I found the kind of rest that heals not just the body, but the soul as well. Well now, partner, looks like our fire's burned down to just glowing embers, and the night's getting deep and peaceful around us. Those stories I shared with you tonight, the desert morning, the mountain storm, the prairie sunset, and the canyon stars. They're all true as the day is long, and they're all still happening somewhere out there in the wide, beautiful world. The thing is, friend, every place has its own kind of magic if you just take the time to notice. Could be the way morning light falls through your window, or how the rain sounds on your roof, or the particular way the stars look from your own backyard. Beauty's everywhere, just waiting for folks who are willing to slow down and see it. So as you settle in for the night, remember that you're part of something bigger and more wonderful than any trouble that might be weighing on your mind. Somewhere out there, the desert's still glowing in the moonlight. Mountains are standing strong against the sky, prairie grass is swaying in the evening breeze, and stars are shining down on canyons carved deep into the earth. Let those peaceful images settle into your dreams, partner. Let them remind you that no matter what tomorrow brings, there's always beauty, always peace, always a reason to hope. Sleep well now, friend. The world's in good hands, and so are you.